King Edward IV ruled England during the 15th century, and his love life was as legendary as his battles. Tall, handsome, and impossibly charismatic, Edward wasn't just a king, he was a heartbreaker long before he ever wore the crown. They called him the most attractive man of his time. Over 6 feet tall, a giant for the era, with broad shoulders, golden hair, and an easy smile that could disarm both enemy soldiers and noblewomen alike. But beneath the charm was a man who didn't just fight wars on the battlefield. He waged them in bedrooms too. Edward IV didn't need power to seduce women. Even as a teenager, he was already making waves. Some said he could talk a woman into bed faster than a priest could say, "Amen." And he didn't discriminate. Noblewomen, married ladies, merchant daughters, and even commoners. Edward saw romance as a game he was born to win. According to chroniclers, Edward had a charming habit of promising marriage to women just to seduce them, then vanishing as soon as the deed was done. His legendary appetite wasn't just whispered in court, it was shouted in gossip circles across England. But one affair would come back to haunt him. Her name was Eleanor Talbot, and if her claims were true, Edward's love life would one day threaten the very foundation of the English crown. Eleanor was a noblewoman, dignified, educated, and according to some reports, madly in love with Edward. She claimed that he secretly married her in private, before he ever met the woman who would become his queen. Now, in the 15th century, secret marriages were taken seriously. If Edward had truly married Eleanor before his official wedding, that meant his future marriage would be invalid, and any children born from it, illegitimate. For a normal man, that would be gossip. For a king, that was dangerous. Years later, long after Edward was dead, his brother Richard would use this very claim to seize the throne, arguing that Edward's heirs had no legal right to rule. But let's not jump ahead just yet, because before all the political chaos, Edward had a love story that turned England upside down. Her name was Elizabeth Wood Villa, a widowed commoner, a woman with no noble title, no foreign alliance, and no powerful family. She was the last person anyone expected Edward to choose as queen. But that's exactly what made it so scandalous. When Edward met Elizabeth, she wasn't just a pretty face, though she was stunning by every account. She was also clever, sharp-tongued, and fiercely protective of her children. She had already been married once, to a knight who died fighting for the opposite side in the Wars of the Roses. She was a Lancastrian widow, asking for help to secure her son's inheritance. She came to plead with the king. She left as his secret wife. Legend says Edward met her under a tree in her family's estate. She refused to become his mistress. He refused to walk away. So, in a moment of passion and defiance, Edward married her in secret, shocking his advisors, his court, and even his closest friends. It was a political nightmare. Kings were supposed to marry for strategy, not love. A French princess, a Spanish duchess, those were the options. Not a widow with no dowry and 2 children in tow. But Edward didn't care. He married her anyway. And when the court found out, all hell broke loose. His most trusted ally, the Earl of Warwick, nicknamed the Kingmaker, was furious. He had been negotiating a foreign marriage for Edward behind the scenes. The sudden, unapproved union with Elizabeth ruined everything. It wasn't just a matter of love. It was a declaration of independence from the king. Edward was saying loud and clear that no one would control his choices, not even his most powerful supporters. But love came with a price. Elizabeth wasn't content to just be queen in name. She used her new position to elevate her family. The Wood villages, once minor nobility, suddenly held important roles, married powerful nobles, and dominated the court. Old families like the Neville and the Percy were enraged. They saw the Wood villages as social climbers, outsiders who had no place in royal politics. The court became a battlefield. Behind velvet curtains and jeweled smiles, alliances formed. Murmurs of rebellion echoed through castles, and eventually, war returned to the land. Edward's marriage hadn't just shaken the court, it had split the kingdom. But even amid this chaos, Edward remained. Edward. He was still chasing women, still holding lavish parties, still surrounding himself with mistresses. One of them, Jane Shore, would become as famous as the Queen herself. Jane wasn't a noblewoman. She was the daughter of a merchant. Beautiful, charming and witty, she quickly became Edward's favourite. Even after his marriage to Elizabeth, Jane held his attention. Unlike many women used and discarded by powerful men, Jane lingered. She had influence. People listened to her. Some even said she used her sway to help others, intervening in legal cases, softening the king's temper. But while Jane was admired, Elizabeth was still queen, and she never forgot it. The tension between mistress and monarch never fully exploded, but it simmered quietly just under the surface. As Edward aged, his appetite didn't fade. He was still throwing wild feasts, still whispering sweet nothings into the ears of court beauties, still making promises he had no intention of keeping. And yet, despite his reckless behavior, the people loved him. He was the king who looked like a hero, sounded like a lover, and fought like a warrior. He was flawed, deeply so, but magnetic. Edward IV wasn't just ruling a kingdom. He was living a legend. But legends don't last forever, and Edward's story was heading toward a storm made of betrayal, bloodlines, and broken hearts. Because when a king builds his world on passion, that world can crumble just as easily. And what followed Edward's death would show just how deadly his desires truly were. After the death of King Edward IV in 1483, England was left teetering on the edge of uncertainty. He had ruled with both charm and force, with kisses and swords. But now the man who had once seduced half the court was gone, and in his place, he left a kingdom torn by secrets. 2 young sons, a grieving queen, and a brother who had been waiting in the shadows. Edward's legacy should have been one of victory. Instead, it became a scandal, one that would echo through centuries. Let's start with Jane Shore, the most famous mistress of Edward IV. Jane had been Edward's favourite in the final years of his reign. Unlike many women used and discarded by the king, Jane had lingered. She wasn't just beautiful. She was quick-witted, intelligent and persuasive. Even after Edward's death, she still carried influence. But times were changing fast. As Richard, Duke of Gloucester, moved to claim the crown, anyone connected to Edward's reign became a threat, especially those close to the Woodville family or to Edward's inner circle. Jane, being neither noble nor protected by royal marriage, was vulnerable. She had one fatal flaw: she didn't stay quiet. After Edward's death, Jane is believed to have supported the Woodvilles' claim to protect Edward's children, the young princes. That was a dangerous position to take in a time when loyalty could cost your life. Richard III, now claiming kingship, accused Jane of being a corrupting force at court. He painted her as a temptress, a manipulator, even a witch, a classic tactic in medieval smear campaigns. It wasn't just about morality, it was about silencing a woman who knew too much. Jane was arrested. She was publicly humiliated, paraded through the streets of London in nothing but a shift, barefoot, carrying a taper, as punishment for loose and wanton behavior. It was a carefully staged show of power. Richard wanted to remind everyone what happened to women who interfered with politics. But despite her fall, Jane never turned bitter. After her punishment, she lived quietly. She never married again, never returned to court. And yet, even centuries later, she remains a symbol of the double standards medieval women faced: loved while useful, punished when no longer convenient. If Jane Shore suffered quietly, Elizabeth Woodville was a different story. When her husband died, Elizabeth lost more than a partner. She lost her protector, and her enemies were many. The powerful nobles still hated her for bringing the Woodville clan into royal circles. Her secret marriage to Edward had never been forgiven. Now, with her sons declared illegitimate by Richard, she had been stripped of everything. But Elizabeth was not a woman to surrender. From sanctuary, a holy refuge in Westminster Abbey, she plotted. She sent letters, made alliances, whispered promises. And perhaps her boldest move: she joined forces with her former enemy, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret was the mother of Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian heir living in exile. Elizabeth offered him a deal. If he invaded England and took the throne, he must marry her daughter, Elizabeth of York. The union would unite the feuding houses of York and Lancaster. It was a desperate gamble, but it worked. In 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III, the man who took the crown from Edward's children, was killed, and just like that, a new dynasty began. The Tudors. Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York, uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York. Their son, Henry VIII, their granddaughter, Elizabeth. They see all of it, set in motion by the widow of a king whose love life had rewritten royal rules. The personal decisions of Edward IV had changed England forever. His secret marriage had ignited a rebellion. His broken promises had handed his enemies the legal tools they needed to claim his children were illegitimate. And his mistresses, once courted and treasured, had been discarded when they no longer served the crown's agenda. Edward may have thought he could compartmentalize his passions, that he could wage war by day and play games of love by night. But in medieval England, kings didn't have private lives. Every affair, every whisper, every kiss in a dark hallway had consequences, because when a king sleeps with power, he often wakes up with war. It wasn't just the throne that Edward's choices shaped, it was the fate of his children. Edward's sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were last seen in the Tower of London. Historians still debate their fate. Were they murdered by Richard III to secure his crown? Or did someone else silence them, afraid of their claim to legitimacy? Either way, their disappearance remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries in British history, and at the center of it, not just a lust for power, but a literal lust, a king who had built his house on secrets. To modern ears, Edward's affairs may sound like tabloid drama, but in his world, who you loved, or claimed to love, wasn't just personal. It was political. A marriage could seal an alliance, or ruin it. A mistress could gain influence, or destroy reputations. A whisper of illegitimacy could erase an heir's birthright. In Edward IV's case, his romantic choices shaped the crown itself. Think about it. If Edward had married a French princess instead of Elizabeth Woodville, England might have strengthened ties abroad, avoiding the resentment at home. If he had kept his promise to Eleanor Talbot, or never made it at all, Richard III might never have had a reason to steal the throne. If he had controlled his passions, his sons might have lived. His dynasty might have endured, but Edward wasn't that kind of king. So, how do we remember Edward IV? Was he a hero, a warrior king who brought peace to a bleeding kingdom? Or was he a cautionary tale, a ruler whose appetite for pleasure left his kingdom vulnerable? The truth is, he was both. He was the lover and the fighter, the seducer and the sovereign, a man who could conquer a battlefield in the morning and a bedroom by night. Edward IV was England's real-life medieval playboy, and like all tragic love stories, his came at a cost. Because when a king plays with hearts, the entire kingdom can end up broken.